Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. This is a collaboration between Civil Servants World, Dodds, and the Open University, supported by Workcast, and you're all very welcome. You'll see that there's a box if you have a question to ask, and I'll try and introduce as many of those as possible into the discussion. And if we can't answer a particular question, we'll see if we can get back to you after the event. There are three of us involved in this panel, and each of us will introduce ourselves when we first speak, rather than me and the chair trying to introduce my colleagues. So just to introduce myself, you're probably thinking, why on earth is an old white man introducing a webinar on diversity and inclusion, which is a good question. And I suppose one possible answer is that I'm a law professor at the Open University now, but a long time ago when I was first appointed as a law professor, it was in 1988 at Queen's University, Belfast. And although I look like an old white man, in Queen's Belfast in 1988, I was perceived to be a Catholic English person and therefore a double minority. In fact, in that intersectionality, as we'd now say, unique. And people criticized my appointment for a number of reasons, but apart from a lack of talent or whatever else, some of them were saying, well, it's just a kind of token gesture to have a Catholic or to have an English person, to have diversity. So I've lived with that in my own small way. And I think that illustrates that the concept of diversity and inclusion reflects fluidity in our identities. It's more complex than it might at first seem. And so we're very lucky today that to conclude the introduction and move towards the substance, I'm going to begin by asking Waqas Ahmed to introduce himself and to introduce the problem, how we got to the current institutional status quo, and why we need to understand that history. Waqas.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is an important discussion, of course, one being had in many a boardroom, many a living room. And I think it's an opportune moment for this discussion because, of course, there's an increase in activism surrounding diversity and everything around it, ranging from the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter, the gay and lesbian rights, and beyond. There's an increasing discussion on things like neurodiversity, disability, what that means within the workplace. It's all a very, very healthy and pertinent discussion to be having at this time. So we will attempt at making our own humble contributions to this. Before that, I wanted to give you a little background about myself and my interest in diversity, which comes from my own personal and professionally diverse background, I suppose. Personally, I come from a mixed background, both I guess ethnically and in terms of socioeconomic class-wise as well. But also what I find very interesting is, and what is less spoken of, I suppose, is professional diversity. So I find myself in, like many of you, I suppose, in some way or another, in and amongst various fields, various professions. Each of you would have different interests, different passions, each of them pertaining to different fields, which we are not always encouraged to embrace that level of professional diversity. And similarly, and to another degree, we haven't traditionally been encouraged to celebrate or even explore and then leverage our own ethnic, gender, or otherwise diversity internally. So I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Open University, charged with exploring some of these issues around diversity in general, but also around academic and professional diversity in the name of interdisciplinarity, i.e. looking at how different disciplines, different fields might work together or might even connect together to form new insights, and how that might manifest within the organizational space as well. So I'm delighted to be taking part in this discussion. It's one I believe that's very important, because there is, notwithstanding what I mentioned earlier on, there is an increasing awareness that this ought to be addressed. But exactly why we have arrived at this status quo, as Simon mentioned earlier on, is something we should be spending a little bit more time investigating and reflecting on, because I believe that reflection and that investigation is what will bring us to a more sincere and therefore more proactive understanding of what diversity means and where it ought to lead in the future. Because of course, one example being, how did the inequities surrounding race and racial discrimination within the workplace, where did that come from? Well, it came from a long history. Simon mentioned the history of prejudice and division in Ireland, but of course, this has been existing worldwide and came in different forms, and led to many divisions, and that permeated deeply within people's psyches and across generations. This developed a series of biases, and these biases have evolved over time and often been confirmed to the detriment of a diverse and inclusive society and workplace. And there is much more to be said about other aspects of prejudice, for example, gender prejudice, but I'm sure we will go on in a bit more depth during the course of the discussion about that. But in the meantime, I thank you again for being here, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you, Wakas. The next phase of our webinar is going to be to look at some concepts, and then the final phase will be to look at what results might mean and what the future might look like. So on concepts, I'm going to begin by asking Stephanie Ruel to introduce herself in the same way, to tell us something about stereotyping and intersectionality, and to tell us, and I'm going to illustrate those 2 points in what I say now, to tell us what it was like to be the only woman engineer in the Canadian Space Agency. Stephanie.
Thank you, Simon. So first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar. It is an important topic of discussion in our contemporary times. There's also some important historical influences that have brought us to where we are today. But let me take a moment to introduce myself. I am first and foremost a mother, and this is what the image is showing you on your screens right now. I have 4 wonderful children and a wonderful partner. I am clearly a white woman, and I identify as being heterosexual. Having said this, while I am now an academic at the Open University, I'm a lecturer in organizational behavior in the Department of People and Organizations. I also self-identify as a former life sciences mission manager, and I worked in the civil service within the Canadian Space Agency. And as Simon introduced, I was the only woman mission manager to do the job that I was doing in contemporary times. So what does it mean to be a life sciences mission manager? Well, some of the images that you see on your screen now highlight some of the things that I did. I did work with Canadian astronauts Bob Thirsk and Chris Hadfield. I also had the opportunity to meet and be mentored by Katie Coleman, one of the US NASA first women astronauts to join the astronaut corps. I spent a lot of my time in the control room listening to multiple and diverse voices through my ears and through various time zones to make sure that we could do science aboard the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle. My research specialties in space were on visual perception and osteoporosis research. So you can maybe gather that I've got a lot of experience working with diverse people, working in the Canadian Civil Service. I'm also very educated. I've got a bachelor's degree in science and mathematics, an MBA, and a doctorate degree. But in spite of all of this experience, working in both an operational environment and a management environment, I was still positioned in a certain way based on my gender and my skin color. And this brings us to the concept of intersectionality. So I've spent a little bit of time introducing who I think I am, and those are my self-identities. Intersectionality brings together different categories of identities and tells us that it's not the individual identity that counts, it's the intersection of those identities together that makes us who we are. So we can talk in terms of self-identity. We can also talk in terms of social identity. And this is where my research as an academic plays a role. I look at how we position ourselves in organizations based on our social identities, or what we perceive to be what a person is like. Now, this perception is built on, years of how we like to categorize people. And this is our way as humans of making sense of the world around us. Unfortunately, while we're making sense of the world around us, we can introduce things like stereotypes. And these stereotypes can be based on these various identities that we see or that we experience with people, such as race or skin color, ethnicity, class, culture, religion, age, able-bodiedness, national belonging, geographical location. All of these things can play together in intersectionality to position individuals to be below someone else. So that's a brief introduction of what intersectionality is. And I look forward to the continuing discussion that we're going to have amongst the three of us.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Waqas. So there may be other concepts that anybody on the panel wants to introduce, and I'd certainly like to talk in a few minutes about parity of esteem. But just before we get there, perhaps, Waqas, you might want to come back on anything Stephanie has said about what does intersectionality mean to society, organizations, individuals, or to illustrate from your own research. And also, we're obviously thinking particularly about the civil service and an organization, and when it says it's reforming itself, what does that mean?
Sure. Well, what I will say is that a few years ago now, I went on the civil service fast stream diversity program, which gave me an interesting insight as to the civil service's approach to diversity back then. I'm talking over 12 years ago now when that happened. But it was very interesting, and it was an important experience for a young graduate like myself to have had, as it sought at least to celebrate diversity and celebrate my own background, which up until then there were a lot of question marks as to whether or not someone of my background belonged in an organization like the civil service, which had a particular demographic and gender makeup, but also had a particular history, one which wasn't always congruous to the history of my own ancestors, for example. So looking at that dynamic was very interesting. Now, since having undergone that program and have had a diverse professional experience myself, I have a professional background in both the arts and the sciences, as well as in international affairs. And I have been fortunate enough to have lived in multiple countries, not just worked in, but lived in multiple countries across 3 or 4 different continents. And again, just like Stephanie mentioned, whereby this kind of vast experience had given her an insight into different perspectives coming from different backgrounds. Likewise, I've been blessed to have undergone, albeit in a different way, a similar experience of diversity, a first-hand experience of diversity. And what that led me to actually was, and this is much of my work here at the Open University is around this, and it does relate to intersectionality as well, is looking at how diversity itself is a hyper-complex phenomenon. Now, what I mean by that, I'll go into it in a second, but Diversity in the current narrative, generally speaking, of course, is seen quite superficially, because, of course, people are interested in action and representation, and so therefore there is a very particular, and in my view, quite a superficial way of looking at how diversity is viewed, and therefore how diversity is then implemented within the workplace. And I think a deeper understanding of diversity and its complexity will allow for a more sustainable impact with regards to diversity in the workplace. And I will just go into, I want to show one slide whereby we will look at this hypercomplexity. Right. Okay.
Can we see that?
Yeah, can we see that one?
Yes, yeah. Diversity is a hyper-complex phenomenon.
Absolutely, right. So as we can see here from this slide, if we just focus on the inner matrix for a second, we can see that every human being has different dimensions to them. They have, as Stephanie mentioned previously, this can comprise of their race, their age, their class, their gender, their politics, their faith, their profession, where they are at with their health, the level of the type of personality, level of intelligence. This could go on, by the way. This is a more, I suppose, a more simplistic understanding of this complexity, if I might say so. But the idea is very clear that every human being has multiple sides to them, even those that may appear quite homogeneous, quote unquote. If they dig deeper, which I will encourage in due course in this session to do, if they dig deeper, they will understand that they have aspects of them that they may not have contemplated before. And that kind of introspection, whereby we look at who we are and the diverse components that make us who we are as individuals, we can then, once we have that appreciation of that inner diversity, I believe we will then have a more appreciation of diversity that surrounds us in society and in the workplace. But also what's important is, another important factor here, and again, much of my research is around this, is that each of these facets require a certain level of knowledge from a certain field or a number of fields to shed more light on it. So as you can see around this matrix, you will see there are different fields, academic fields, professional fields, like political science, anthropology, world history, evolutionary biology, etc., that each have an important contribution to make in understanding something like race. So you cannot fully understand race except in a superficial manner unless you were to delve deeper into understanding the anthropological aspect, the psychological aspect, the world history, so how this whole idea of race evolved over time, and again, looking at political science and how it might have been politicized, etc. So each of these have a complex makeup of their own, and together they each form connections which are even more complex. Hence, diversity as a concept is hyper complex. And as long as we understand that, that should lead us to a level of humility, whereby we try to, we appreciate our inner diversity as well as the external, which ought to then to change our behaviors. So my, what I would call for is for every individual, regardless of where you're at within your organization, in this case, the civil service, to look deeper into their own diverse makeup. What can they identify within this matrix and beyond, and then appreciate their own complexity, and therefore the complexity of their colleagues, their managers, their people within their family and friend circles, etc. And then understand actually how a greater understanding of this diversity might lead to a greater understanding of the phenomenon as a whole, and therefore our behavior towards the other. And we'll soon realize that if we are going to otherize others, which we ought not to do, then we ought to otherize them in a manner that is appreciative of their uniqueness. And so with that renewed understanding of diversity, we'd hope that we'd have a change in general behavior and therefore work culture within the organization.
Thank you very much, Wakas. I'm going to go to a couple of questions, and the first is for Stephanie, and then the second will come back to you, Wakas, on that. The first one, Stephanie, Maria, who's an inclusion manager, asks, what did you say exactly about your skin color and whether it's had an impact on your career or not? Could you just expand on that a little, please?
Right. So thank you for that question, Maria. So the point I was trying to make was we can try and take apart our individual identities and talk to those. However, intersectionality tells us that we are much more complex than just being white or black. A black woman's experience is very different than a white woman's experience in an organization. We have enough empirical evidence now to make such a statement. And so that was my point. I was trying to get across that, yes, I can break myself out into these different individual elements, but I am really more complex than these individual identity categories. It's the complexity of me as a human that is more important than just simply one identity factor.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I hope that answers the question, Maria. Paula has asked, was there a reason for not having disability in those core concepts, Wakas? And I'll give another question as well. Paul has said, which is really a question for both of you, will we ever reach a point in our civilization where we will simply view each other as human without the automatic application of labels, where we value difference instead of using it to drive a wedge between ourselves? So, Wakas, first of all, was there a reason for not having disability in core definitions?
Within the matrix, you have health, and that health pertains to physical or mental ability or disability. So whatever level whatever form of disability you may have, mental or physical, that definitely impacts your position or your makeup within the matrix. So yes, it is important.
Thank you. And Stephanie or Wakas, on Paul's question, will we ever get to the point where we're just humans, or do we have to go through a very long period in which we have that hyper complex, if you like, multiple identities approach?
I love this question. Thank you, Paul. I think I'm a bit of an idealist like you are. I would love to see the day in my lifetime where we just see each other as humans and we respect each other as humans and move beyond these categorizations and these stereotypes and the discourses that follow those identities and stereotypes. So yes, I'm hopeful that we will see that day, and I can reassure you that many of us in academia are working hard to get society and get academia to that point of seeing everybody as a human.
Thank you. Wakas, on that?
Yes, yes, this is a very worthy ideal to strive towards, of course, but it must come with an important caveat, which is that we must understand what led us here in the first place. Why are we in this current position? Because if we're just looking at the future alone, then we will not understand what some of the foundations of the problem actually are. So therefore, the work of academics as well as practitioners in this field are very, very important, and the work of activism is even more important because it puts pressure on organizations to not just make change, but make meaningful and sustainable change, and one where a change that's driven by a greater consciousness of the problem. And this is where I feel within this sphere generally, we find lacking a lot of, which is a greater consciousness, a deeper consciousness of the problem, not just realizing, not taking for granted that it's a problem, but looking at why it is a problem and what its origins may have been. So I think once we have as a society, we have that general understanding, we can then move towards the ideal we want to strive towards, and then before moving there, we can have a roadmap that people generally agree on.
Thank you very much, Waqas and Stephanie, and thank you to Maria and Paula and Paul for those questions. Other questions are coming in. Before I go to those, I want to move us between that first section on what are some of the concepts and on to what would the results be, what would we look like as a civil service or as a society, say 5 years on, 10 years on. But the other concept I just wanted to touch on is parity of esteem. And this is a phrase you probably know from, amongst other places, from education particularly in England and Wales after the Second World War. The idea there would be secondary schools or secondary modern schools, technical schools and grammar schools, but they would have parity of esteem, which was a lovely idea, except they didn't really have parity of esteem. So in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and what became the peace process, we talked about parity of esteem, but some people didn't like that phrase, meaning between different communities. Some people didn't like that phrase because the experience in education was that it wasn't great, it didn't work. And others thought it was just a kind of Trojan horse, a trick to help a previously disadvantaged group at the expense of the previously privileged group. Nonetheless, there is something in it which is of value if only we understood what parity was and what esteem is. And this comes back, I think, to something which Waqas said about valuing people's diversity, valuing them as whole individuals. And I think it's in keeping with Paul's point. So from my point of view, for instance, working in universities, I sometimes wonder if people really value the diversity of our university system, or if they don't label our graduates or our staff depending on where we are. I went to Balliol College, Oxford, and Yale Law School. But I've worked in a variety of institutions which have been committed to widening access to promoting diversity. But some people look down on those and say, well, they're former polytechnics or whatever. And there are all sorts of subtle ways of saying we want to have people from elite institutions, or we just label, stereotype because of how you came into higher education. So these are the kinds of things which we need to talk about. Certainly if we're going to reform the civil service from the inside in your cases. And before I ask Waqas and Stephanie if they want to comment on that, I better go to some of the other questions which include, how do you get beyond the issue of first impressions, the paradigm of presentation over content? Another questioner says, disability has little to do with health. Don't we need to embrace a social model of disability? You'll be pleased to know that we're thanking you for the responses. And then, last question for the moment, does the notion of recognizing us all only as humans, doesn't it ignore the intrinsic idea of the self and self-worth, which is often related to identifiers such as your origins? So there's a vibrant debate going on in the chat box, for which many thanks. And it does, I think, relate to this issue, particularly in relation to those who come with disabilities. Is it all about first impressions, presentation? Even noticing an invisible disability is impossible in most circumstances by definition. And can we show parity of esteem to one another? Stephanie and then Waqas, and then we're going to move on.
So thank you for those wonderful questions. I love the engagement that these questions are showing to us. If I can talk a little bit about able-bodiedness or disability, we have all these labels that we try to use respectfully to identify individuals. And I'll give my daughter as an example. to make my point about able-bodiedness. I don't use typically these labels of able-bodiedness, disability. I talk about challenges. My daughter is Asian born. We adopted her at 2.5 years old, and she is considered legally blind. Now, it's an invisible disability. Most people wouldn't know that she's legally blind. However, with certain accommodations in place, she's able to navigate the world in a safe and engaged way. So this brings in the idea of accommodations, and accommodations feed into our concepts of inclusion to level the playing field. So my daughter cannot see in the dark. So that means our house is usually well lit. Except for today, because we're having a massive snowstorm in Montreal, Canada, where I find myself. But typically we have the house very well lit, and that makes her included in our household. So by this simple accommodation of having all the lights on, she can navigate her world successfully and be included with the barriers being removed. So this goes to the other point about being humans. And we have to obviously take into account my daughter's background, culturally, ethnically, pardon me, and her abilities with regard to her vision. We see her as a complete package. She is a teenage girl who's very sure and of her convictions and the way she wants to go through life. And we celebrate that as a human package. She is not just blind. She is a very complex individual that is included in our society.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very moving. Very insightful. Wakas.
Thank you.
Move on.
Yeah. Very good questions, and thanks for addressing the issue of health or disability, Stephanie. I think I agree with that. I think we do need these labels ought to be discussed, debated, and ultimately transcended. But allow me to just talk about the first impressions question, which I thank whoever it was to raise that. It's important because what's required here is a wider societal cultural change about how we view our fellow humans. And it sounds it sounds a little bit too macro, but let's go a bit more micro into how we're going to deal with this. Firstly, the education system. Now, we cannot have so the first impressions idea often is manifested in the workplace, for example, interviews and when we meet new colleagues, etc., etc. But where does that come from? Let's look at the education system. Now, is the current education system, and I mean primary, secondary, and higher, is it encouraging inclusivity? Is it encouraging the kind of diversity and the complex diversity and the embrace of that? Is it encouraging that? Is it encouraging curiosity about somebody's background, and a positive curiosity, a curiosity that wants to know more about not just the surface level facts that might be in front of them at the time, i.e. the color of the skin and the gender, etc., but a curiosity in terms of wanting to learn more and understand that person more towards the aim of respecting them and perhaps even learning from them. So if we embedded these values through the curriculum, through various curricula, through a general educational environment, which of course many educational institutions are doing to a great degree, but I feel it's not happening at that wider societal level as it should be. Then you'll find that when these children or students then go into the workplace, as graduates, they then have developed by then a certain mindset which would be completely counterintuitive to judging people by first impressions, and would very naturally look at people in a curious and open-minded way. And that then ought to be, now moving to the workplace, that then ought to be encouraged within the workplace. That ought to be encouraged in various ways, including the actual protocols of the organization, the actual culture that it develops, etc., etc. So I think this first impressions mindset is something that has resulted from, unfortunately, errors within the education system, or shortcomings, should I say, within the education system, and how that then is reinforced by our workplaces in general. And civil service certainly has this from my experience, but it's no different to many other organizations in that respect.
Thank you very much for that. It was Julian, I didn't give the name, but it was Julian who asked that. And Julian's also come in with a statement, you'll be glad to know, which is that Julian sees his impairment as a superpower, which is a positive, which is getting a thumbs up from the panel. And I'd like to come back to that at the end if I can. We need to look on at the future. That's what we've been asked to do by the civil service, and say, what would reform look like? What would it be like? What would the civil service be like in 5 years or 10 years? Or indeed, what would a university or any organization or society look like? And is it just a question of quotas, targets, which sounds very civil service to me? And that could lead to box ticking and actually just deciding that this particular characteristic will help me in my reporting. Do we want something more than that? And if so, what might that be? How would it look like? And perhaps I could ask Waqas, I think you've used the phrase, how do we curate diversity?
Very, very good point. And thank you very much for that question. Yeah, diversity can bring with it many challenges. And this is something I think is a core concern of academics as well, that are looking at diversity. As to in the future, okay, fine, we move towards greater representations. We might do that via quotas or any other means. But how sustainable will that model then be? I.e., once you then do meet the quotas, you have sufficient representation, quote unquote. How sustainable is that? Or will it then lead to even further issues? So issues that might emerge from diversity, and here we have to be honest. When you have diverse perspectives, and each of these different facets that we discussed do bring with them different perspectives to any given problem, challenge, organization, etc. When you have many different perspectives, that's often seen in a positive light, which it ought to, and actually it should be seen in that light. But it could also lead to conflicting views, conflicting opinions, conflicting personalities, which can then be detrimental to productivity, to developing a safe and amicable and positive energy within the workplace. It could have the detrimental impact that organizations want it to have. So firstly, we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that there will be challenges moving forward when we get to that stage, unless we get to a stage where we recognize that diversity will bring with it a wealth of knowledge, ideas, capabilities, etc. But how do we then curate them, as you've mentioned? How do you then curate them and design this diversity in a way that it has a positive impact on creativity, growth, productivity, in a way that's sustainable? And there are many ways in which academics are looking into this, and many good positive case studies coming out of organizations as well. But one of them might be, for example, developing a culture which you might call an ideas culture, where you encourage ideas to be brought forth rather than suppressed. You encourage that through various platforms, various fora, whether they be through individual discussions or focus groups or wider organizational gatherings, whether it be done in a way that's personal or anonymous. There are many ways in which it can be done. But once you have that culture developed, where ideas are allowed to be expressed in their entirety, then you need a management that can synthesize those ideas effectively in a way that it aligns with the vision, mission, and values of the organization as a whole. And then that ought to have be reflected on constantly, or at least intermittently, as you go on. So what this allows for is a greater sustainability of that diversity, which I fear will be the main challenge if we continue to look at diversity in a superficial way that we've warned against.
Thank you. Before I come to Stephanie, just to bring our participants in a little, Stephanie, but this relates to what we were saying. Tony has asked, is the civil service any different nowadays to the image portrayed in Yes, Prime Minister? Meaning, do you have to be one of those sort of Eton, Oxford boys to progress? But Andrea has said, not knowing that that was a question from somebody else, has said that some of her experience of the civil service is it is challenging the notion that it's all about quotas in favor of thinking hard about integration and openness, so that there are positive signs. But Stephanie, what do you think the results should be? What are we looking for in curating diversity, in having a more open culture, if you like?
Yeah, wonderful questions. Again, thank you for your engagement. If I can tie together some ideas that Waka shared to answer this question, we can look at the meso, which is, the organizational level policies and procedures and quotas that the organization is trying to achieve. But if we're really going to curate diversity, we need to also look at the micro, which is the individual interactions in the everyday type of organization in the civil service. We also need to look at the policies and procedures that are in place within the organization. But we also need to look at the macro, the larger international or national environment that's influencing how we curate diversity. So looking again at the micro or the personal interactions is very important. Yes, there can be conflict. Yes, there can be disagreement. If it's done in a respectful manner and that it doesn't position individuals to be below another, we can harness those conflicts and those discussions to move the organization and the industry and the national makeup forward to be a more inclusive type of world that we live in.
Yeah, let me add to that very quickly. That is a very, very important point because I'm sure there'll be a lot of management on this in this webinar as participants as well. I think the effective training of management in how to deal with leverage and deal with the sensitivities of curating this diversity is very important. So a lot of work is going into this. Again, the translation of the academic to the practitioner space is something that needs to be very carefully managed in its own right. And then once we have that training and those workshops that move beyond kind of getting to a place of diversity and move and go further into how we might manage that diversity, that would be important. And another important aspect of management, if I may say so, is being able to untap the diversity of each individual within your team. So, for example, currently you might have a team that within which you have people that have specific job roles, but then the further you get to know that individual team member, the further you realize the level of their own diversity and the perspectives that wouldn't otherwise be tapped into if that communication was not reached. So I believe there must be an extra emphasis by management to engage their team members in order to untap the fruits of those diversities.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a very specific question asked by Miriam in a second to our two panelists. And then I'm going to go to three broader questions. And by the time the panelists have answered that and I've had an opportunity to say something, we'll be close to our hour. So I'm very grateful to everybody who's been making statements and asking questions. And the next one is Miriam saying, sometimes unconscious bias exists in recruitment practices. How should organizations address this issue? Stephanie, please.
Yes, fantastic question. One of the things that I recommend to individuals, both my undergraduate students and in the practitioner world, was to do an inherent bias test. There's a wonderful one that's quite extensive by Harvard University. It's free, it's available online. You do it at your own pace, and it can be quite a revealing experience for an individual to go through those inherent bias tests and to take the time to reflect on those inherent biases, to be aware of them before you go into into an interview situation where those first impressions, which Waka's talked about earlier, it can guide you to, positioning that individual unfairly. So taking the time to identify those inherent biases is an important step to take.
Thank you. Wakas?
Yes, I would echo exactly that. You need to firstly dig deep and understand where your unconscious biases may lie. These might be unearthed through various tests, as mentioned, but often they can be unveiled through self-education and understanding more about the society that you live in, the kind of the people that comprise that society, how that diversity may have come about, so that the very first thing that you start doing consciously when entering those arenas of interviews and so on is saying, okay, I am going to have some subconscious biases, and if I'm going to have them, let our first impression be go deeper, and let's make a conscious effort to make that first impression go deeper. So often what happens is these things take time, and it's often reflective of the societies we live in. So again, there are things that we can do at the individual level for sure, but then we must also raise awareness of these biases that exist within organizations and society as a whole for a more general cultural shift.
Thank you. Another very specific question. Do the panel have any ideas about how to identify discrete behaviors which are a problem and how to tackle them in the workplace? That's from, thank you very much for that question. Stephanie? Are there people blocking, and what can you do about their behaviors if you want to create a more diverse, inclusive workplace, say in the civil service?
Right. So let me use an example from my research. I interviewed this late career STEM professional woman who had been in the technical and space industry for well over 25 years. And she was in a meeting with her superior discussing the way forward for a particular mission. And she was told by her superior that she was a dog. And she was a dog that needed to be kept on a leash. That positioning that happened in that meeting was so upsetting, as you can imagine, for this late career STEM professional woman, that she did not know what to do on the spot with that labeling that was given to her in this meeting situation with her superior. She thought about it a long time. And she thought about it so much that it became her persona. And she used it during the 3-hour interview I had with her. She referred to herself as the dog constantly. And I don't think she realized at that point how ingrained that had become as part of who she is. What I've counseled people after sharing this story is you have to acknowledge that if you're called a dog on a leash during a meeting, it may take you a few minutes to recognize that you have just been positioned in a discriminatory fashion. And you may not be able to, on the spot, react to it. You can give yourself permission to walk away and think about it. If there had been somebody else in the meeting, that person could speak up and ask, why did you call this person a dog on the leash? Have a conversation about what just happened, to stand up for that other person who has been positioned. Obviously, there's also training that can be done to preempt this sort of discourse that can happen on a daily basis.
Okay, thank you, Wakas.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a space created within the organization. So in this case, within civil service, if it doesn't already, dedicated to providing people with the opportunity to express concerns about these matters in an open and frank way, and perhaps even in an anonymous way, if that's relevant. But the organization itself needs to encourage the expression of openness. And the other thing is that the example that Stephanie gave is a very real one. These things certainly do happen within organizations, but more often than that, there's a lot of implicit, indirect prejudice that exists, that often builds up to create a very disturbing atmosphere for the team and for individuals within that team. And I think this again is a reason for the creation of a kind of platform, a forum, or a space where people that are encountering implicit and explicit forms of discrimination can form a group whereby they discuss this. And often on discussion, it might emerge that it's this is something that doesn't require any action at the stage that they're at, but often it would, and it often requires affirmation by others for you to go ahead and take action. So I think the organization needs to take a leading role in that.
Thank you. Now, there's a lot of comments and questions coming through. Many people are saying thank you for your presentations and for answering their questions so openly and directly. Others are saying we've got over 400 people here, and others are having to peel off because they know it's a maximum of an hour, but obviously people have clashes. So we only have 9 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is to just read some of the other questions and then give Stephanie and Waqas one last chance. They can't answer all of them, but just to get a flavor of one you'd most like to answer. And we'll try and answer them in some other way. So people have been making some very powerful comments and asking questions. For instance, has asked, how do we go about successfully educating people on the value of individual differences in society when young children have access to social media that tailors content to fit certain narratives based on so many conflicting approaches? It's particularly problematic in teenagers. In other words, is it too late once we get into the civil service? And how can we influence wider society? Also, questions are coming in about COVID and lockdown, which I think is particularly helpful to see that this has been a difficult year. For instance, for people with autism, we're being asked about that. Other people are asking, is the civil service facing particular difficulties because it has a problem of many different departments, and they may be competing in various ways for budget to do these things, for instance? Others are saying, actually, doesn't the civil service move beyond what we're saying? And it's got a good sense of how it can create a better future for us all, a more open one. Harvard implicit test has been talked about. The recommendation is, you can read articles about this, is that take it more than once. Keep checking yourself. And then others are asking about the microaggressions in an office environment. How do you, I understand on the very big issue, when somebody's made some appalling comment and people have come in support of the poor interviewee there and said others should do something about it. But what about microaggressions? How do you decide whether to let something go or whether to challenge it? Now, we'll do it, Stephanie and then Waqas. Are there any of those which you could give us a last thought on, please? And then I'll, as chair, take the last word. Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful questions again, a lot to think about. I think I'll pick on social media and teenagers. I have a house full of teenagers, and social media is always a concern. One of the things that I find important is when I have open discussions with my children about their daily experiences at school and with social media. And when they bring something up that's contentious, that they've seen on social media, I try to have an open discussion about it and have them analyze the situation with some guidance from me. Being the style of person that I am is not one to say in an authoritarian voice, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this, women have a right to work, for example. This is a big discussion that we have around the table, is the positioning of women below men in organizations. I try to nurture an open conversation, and I think given the influence of social media and how insidious it can be, I think we as adults need to take a step back and nurture those open types of conversations, too, tied into microaggressions, because those microaggressions can become insidious. They can run as an undercurrent where you're not aware of them and how it can position individuals to be below the other. So just to wrap this up, I think having open conversations about these contentious issues is an important step forward, as opposed to always embracing silence.
Thank you, Stephanie, for those tips and indeed profound answers. Thank you, Waqas.
Profound answers indeed. Thank you. And the engagement has been phenomenal, and all of the questions or comments that have been read out, Simon, have been very pertinent.
Yeah, really nice.
Educational for us in many ways. So what I will say is, yes, social media, the way that social media is generally structured, technically speaking, so algorithmically, how that leads to echo chambers, and how that can lead to further division and suspicion virtually, because after all, that's how we're predominantly communicating these days in the lockdown. Speaking about lockdown itself, is the erosion of community is something that's being spoken about a lot within the media as well as within academia now, as a result of the lockdown situation. So again, we need to find more channels, more avenues through which we can openly communicate and get to know one another in preparation for when hopefully we're back in the physical space. So I think we need to keep going with that. But I think the more general point here I'll make is that there's recently a book that's come out called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this is I'm sure many of the participants here would be aware of it, but it makes a general case, and this applies for other forms of discrimination as well. But it makes a case for not just passively condemning discrimination, racism in that case, but for each of us in our own ways to become activists and to speak out through action as well as through mobilization on many of these issues. Whether it's within our organizational context, as I said, we need to play a more active role in developing the channels and the fora through which we can discuss and take action on these issues. We shouldn't just leave it to management or to the board or anything like that. It should be driven from dare I say, bottom up. It should be driven from the grassroots of an organization, just as it would within a society. And so that pressure should be constantly kept on to the point at which it becomes culture to become an anti-racist or an anti-prejudicing individual. And I think we should do that not just generally within our organizations, because that's just one sphere in which we operate, in our professional sphere, but also within our families and within our societies and communities in general. If we each took that approach to whatever degree, some people might take activism very seriously and want to organize something at a great scale, and other people just want to speak out against a small injustice that happened in their neighborhood, whatever it might be. I think everyone has an obligation to change this culture.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. I particularly appreciate the participants' time and thoughtfulness. Our panelists, Stephanie, Waqas, Workcast, Dodds, the civil service worlds, but the Open University itself, particularly Liz Moody, Laura Edwards. The Open University says it's trying to be open to people, places, methods, and ideas. And that's a challenge, to keep open year after year to new students, to new colleagues, to new concepts, to new challenges such as Brexit or lockdown. But that's what we're trying to do. And my tip would be, I suppose, that you need to check, not just the famous phrase of checking your privilege, but you need to check that you've understood the different perspectives in an issue. The way it was put to me at law school when I was a student was, you may have one view of the cathedral, but there are other people, and this is a reference to Monet's studies of the cathedral at Rouen. There are other people all the way around. Some of them are painting from the left and you're painting from the right, or the other way. And you don't understand the richness and power of the cathedral unless you're actually interested in, well, what picture are they painting? Why is it different to them? Unless you go inside and understand the purpose, you still won't get what that institution is about or that building is about. And Monet himself said he wasn't really painting the cathedral, he was painting the atmosphere between the object and himself. And trying to capture the atmosphere in the civil service or a university is a challenge. But I particularly wanted to thank people asking that question about lockdown and autism. And there are a few similar questions. I could just reach for this book because these are real bookcases. In fact, I will. There's a book here, JMAC, which I came across because Clive Woodward, the England rugby coach, gave a seminar to rugby coaches. I was involved in this. And he was asked, what's the most inspiring moment in the history of sport? People presumably thought he might say his World Cup final win. And he said, it's the JMAC news story in America, which was current at the time, which was a young high school student with autism, couldn't get on the team, but was the manager and running around helping everybody. But in the final game, the coach determined to put him on. And he came on and he took his long shots and the first two didn't work and everybody was worried. But in the end, he made it. And the reason why that works as a story in America is children everywhere are throwing baskets. And his autism was turned from a disability into an ability because he practiced every day, all the time. But other people thought he couldn't do it in a game. And I feel that about the diversity I see around me in our university and elsewhere, that there are all sorts of people with abilities as well as being stigmatized as having disabilities. And it's not just fun to work in that environment, it's very stimulating. But the question is, how do we give everybody else the chance to flourish? Because that's the kind of organization and community and society that we all want to be in. So we stand ready to help if we possibly can as the Open University. I realize that lots of people involved today have come as consultants or as experts, and they're helping the civil service. And if we can help you, then we'd be delighted to do that. And the final thing I wanted to say is that in universities, when students graduate, I say to them, you're going out with a certificate, but much more than that, there'll be something that has touched you in this experience, which you're not conscious of at the moment, but over the years, over the decades, it'll suddenly click. And I think that's true in organizations generally. And that's one of the very important reasons why diversity matters and inclusion matters, because we all deserve to have that variety of experiences. And from that, we will take maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years' time, something special from our peers, from our colleagues, from, in our cases, our students. But for the civil service, often the clients, the citizens, the people that you are serving. So from us, thank you very much indeed.